The President talked about this morning at the National Prayer Breakfast, talked about the recruiting numbers. Now, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, earlier in the week talked about December. The Army had its best recruiting numbers in 12 years. And last month, the Army hit its best recruitment numbers in 15 years. Now, is this a coincidence, or is it because of the stark contrast between this administration and the previous one? Joining me now to discuss this and much more, freshman Congressman Pat Harrigan. He is making his first appearance here on Washington Watch. He is a decorated Green Beret who is currently a member of the House Armed Services Committee, as well as on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. He represents North Carolina's 10th Congressional District. Congressman, welcome to Washington Watch and welcome to Congress.
Hey, Tony, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
First of all, you have quite the resume. You have been stationed around the world, spent some of your time in Afghanistan. You and your wife also run a successful business which manufactures American-made defense product. Now, this turnaround that I mentioned in recruitment numbers that the President talked about this morning, if I'm not mistaken, that's part of why you ran for Congress, the need for leadership.
That's exactly right. I had not a political bone in my body, Tony, until I watched Afghanistan fall. And I knew at that point that we had just condemned the next generation of Americans to conflict. If we want to fight, we should be weak. And we had never been weaker than that one moment in our nation's history. And so we need real change in this country. We need real leadership. Thankfully, we have it. And as you were talking about with the record-breaking January recruitment cycle that the Army had, I think that there is a resounding consensus that that leadership is back. And this is a military that our young men and women want to join again.
I mean, look, I'm a Marine veteran, and I know there's a lot of young men and women who are willing to serve this country, but they don't want to serve for no reason. They want to serve, and they're willing to make sacrifice if it's for a purpose. And I think, as you pointed out, what happened in Afghanistan was disastrous. And it just, I think it turned many young men and women away thinking, what's the point?
Well, I think a lot of us and a lot of your viewers that have a biblical worldview would identify with this, that I think there's a genuine question prior to President Trump getting elected. What are we fighting for, right? Are we fighting for those time-tested concepts of freedom, democracy, free market economies, and the things that, you know, our fathers and forefathers have fought and died for in order to make this country the greatest country on the face of the earth? Or are we fighting for some sort of social agenda that we are actually trying to project across the globe? I think that was a question in many folks' minds prior to November 5th. And so it's just great to see that I think America is back. That strong, principled America that traditionally leads the world is back, and it's here to stay moving forward.
Let's turn now to the first bill that you have filed in Congress, titled the Americans Act, and it seeks to do a course correction for the military members who were fired after refusing to take the COVID-19 shots. It sounds like the president's helping you out there.
Oh, Tony, I'll tell you, we were thrilled when President Trump took our legislation and made an executive order out of it, right? We are outcome focused around here, but the Americans Act is what I sponsored in the House. Senator Ted Cruz led it in the Senate. And that was an effort to reinstate the 8,400 servicemen and women that were wrongfully discharged for refusing to take the COVID vaccine under President Biden's administration. And we've got to keep in mind why this was so important. And we truly had a weaponized vaccine mandate for political purposes that ultimately impacted not only the careers, but also the retirements and the associated educational and healthcare benefits that 8,400 of our servicemen and women had earned. And it was stripped from them when they were kicked out of the military and given either other than honorable or general discharges. This has never happened before in our nation's history, and it was something that Senator Ted Cruz and I were adamant that needed to be corrected.
Congressman, there's, I think, a few differences between the president's executive order and your bill, if I'm not mistaken.
There is. And one of the most important things that remains in our legislation is taking away the decision-making authority for what the vaccine mandate ought to be for the Department of Defense and taking that out of the executive branch. So taking that away from the president, taking away from the Secretary of Defense, and it puts it in Congress's hands. And what that does is that in any type of future vaccine mandate scenario, slows the process down, requires broad consensus of both parties to determine what ought to be getting injected into the veins of our servicemen and women, and it will prevent a weaponized vaccine mandate forever happening in our Department of Defense ever again for political purposes.
So this legislation that you and Senator Cruz have, this needs to continue to move forward.
Yes, it does. And it will be narrowly tailored at this point because President Trump has come in and taken, everything that we'd put in the bill and already enacted it, which is fantastic. We want things to move quickly and we want the right outcomes to happen. That's happened. There's just that one little remaining piece that we want to see go all the way through the House, the Senate, and get signed into law by the president.
Congressman, I know this is your first interview here on Washington Watch. I'm familiar with you. You serve alongside Congressman Mark Harris of North Carolina as well, who is very close to Family Research Council. I want to go personal here for just a moment, and we're almost up against a break. I'm going to ask you, can you hold over when we get to this break? You got to run to the House floor?
Okay. I can hold for a little bit, yeah.
I want to get your reaction to showing up to Capitol Hill. What was most surprising to you when you got to Washington?
It's unbelievably humbling. And you realize, and I'll tell you, when we were voting for the Speaker of the House, I had my two daughters on the floor. It's the one time that you're allowed to take your children that are under 12 onto the House floor during session. You're not allowed to do that with any family friends. And one of my daughters, my youngest daughter named McKinley, she fell asleep during the process. And it struck me because we're going through this tremendously consequential moment where nobody kind of knew what was going to happen. We didn't know if Republicans were going to be unified, whether we were going to have a repeat of what happened 2 years ago with Kevin McCarthy. And my daughter's just down at my feet sleeping. And, it really hit me as I looked at her that really she represents everyone that I'm up here to represent, all of their children. And the decisions that we make, they might not fully appreciate or understand or be paying attention to, but they are very consequential to what kind of future they're going to live.
Congressman, hold it right there. We're going to be right back. Congressman Harrigan, I want you to continue that because I think it's an apt illustration of the importance of what happens here. Even though we may not know it, we've got tremendous responsibility in what takes place on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, it just struck me at that point in time, every decision that I make is going to affect her life directly, and it's going to affect the lives of the kids of all of my constituents and ultimately all those across the United States of America, and even more broadly than that, across the world and those places that are aspiring to be free. And so, you've got to take this job with an awful lot of humility. It's an unbelievable responsibility, and just work to wake up each and every day and pray that I can live up to the expectations that my constituents have of me.
You mentioned a moment ago, and I know this about you from Mark, about a biblical worldview, about operating from a standpoint of faith. Talk about how you see that playing into your role as a member of Congress.
I came to Christ when I was a junior in high school, and actually it was watching a Billy Graham crusade. And ever since then, throughout my track to West Point, even the decision to go to West Point, the decision to move into the infantry as opposed to aviation, which was what I really wanted to do, and then moving from the infantry to the special forces, moving from special forces into business, and then moving from business into this role that I have now in Congress. Each and every one of those decisions was a very clear calling from the Lord on my life, and something that my wife and I submitted to, that my family is now submitting to, as I have two little young girls that don't know what it's like for dad to be deployed. Only mom knows what that's like. And so we take that calling very seriously. And I think anybody that understands what it means to be called by God to do something, you never know what exactly that call is going to be, but when you get it, you just don't say no. And that's the worldview that I have up here. That's how my service is guided. And ultimately, with being responsible both to my God and to my constituents and to my country, certainly guides my votes.
Pat, I always like to ask this question of new members who come to Capitol Hill, believers that come. Were you surprised by the number of men and women of deep committed faith here in Washington?
You know, I would say that it is something that I'm still feeling out. I have not been here for, I think today or maybe a couple days ago, it was just a month. So it's a little early to make judgments and decisions. And you really got to take a long period of time, I found in my life, to really get to know somebody. And you never really know someone until you go through some tough times with them. And so I would say jury's still out on the depth of that commitment for folks up here, but I'm very hopeful. And I certainly know that we have that in our speaker, which I'm very grateful for. I don't know that this country has had faithful leadership like his in a long, long time.
Well, fair enough. I'll check back with you in 6 months on that question. And,
Please do.
And we'll get an answer.
I'll give you an honest answer, Tony.
We just got a couple minutes left. I want to talk about the other big issue this week. And there's a lot of big issues in the last 3 weeks since President Trump returned to the Oval Office. But Gaza, what's happening in the war between Israel and Hamas, about halfway through the hostage peace or the ceasefire agreement. President says he's going to clean out Gaza and rebuild. Your thoughts?
I think it's a novel approach. And I think clearly there is a lot of talk about whether this is a good idea, a bad idea. What I would point to the folks that say this is a bad idea is that where has a good idea materialized that has led to adequate results? We are stuck in a cycle of terroristic violence with the Gaza Strip. And it's having done a lot of business with Israel. I've been to Israel many, many times. You look at Tel Aviv and what Tel Aviv has become. It is full of a people that are here to live. And you go right across the border into Gaza, and it has always been a place of destruction. And it's folks that, in many cases, who are supporting terrorism are living to die. And that's a very different perspective than we have with our Christian worldview on the next life and what our role and responsibility here is in this life. And so I think President Trump is onto something. This is something that's been talked about for several years, particularly in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, of we need to come up with a different construct rather than repeat the same old history of violence that continues to replicate itself over and over and again.
You're a quick study. I think that's exactly what he is doing. He's changing the conversation, because what we have seen for decades is just a fallback. Well, we need a two-state solution. That's the solution, when in fact Gaza proved that that is not. So we got to change the conversation. Pat Harrigan, I want to thank you for joining us again. Welcome here to Washington, D.C. Look forward to working with you.
Tony, thanks for having me on tonight. Look forward to meeting you in person. Take care.